So when I was a newer DM running a module for the first time, getting to a place like Ank'Harel is something that I dreaded. There's a certain safety when you're first starting out of having maps provided and having kind of a very linear path through the adventure, having the encounters designed for you. And I think that's the best way to really start. But as you do more and more sessions, you start to get accustomed to DMing. And it's time to expand out from those linear paths and really take the training wheels off and see what you can do. I'm gonna tell you how I would think about running this section and my thought process and which parts I would focus on and kind of not focus so much on, because it is the longest chapter in the book. This is the chapter that's really gonna allow you to flex those DM muscles and start to grow, and your games are gonna be so much better after you sort of get out of that linear paved path. And it's actually really exciting. So let's start taking it one step at a time. I have several other guides for Call of the Netherdeep. If you want to see a different section, just check up there. Around the time that the players get to the Betrayer's Rise, I'm going to start rereading this section, but I'm not going to try to memorize it or read every single thing in the entire chapter. It's the longest chapter. What I want to do is refresh myself on the big picture of Ank'Harel, who the major players are and how they interact, because that's going to allow me to improvise stuff as it comes up. We're in an urban metropolis, and there's a lot of possibilities on what the players can do because stuff just exists here that didn't in the small town of Jigao and places like that. The first thing to focus on is the factions and understanding who they are. The Allegiance of Allsight is the first one. They're kind of like the Ivy League, they're prestigious. They've been petitioning Jaman Sa-Ord, who runs the city, for decades to try and let them open up the sunken city beneath Ank'Harel in order to do research down there. And finally, he has relented, he's allowed that, and that's what set up a big piece of our adventure. And the Allegiance has found ruidium, they're trying to harvest it like crazy, they're trying to get into the Netherdeep. Next is the Consortium of the Vermilion Dream. They're kind of cultists and kind of researchers. They're obsessed with this moon, Ruidus. They operate out of hideouts and kind of move around all the time, and they take some shadier tactics, and they've actually infiltrated the Allegiance of Allsight because they want ruidium, and they want to get into Kael Morro, and they want to get into the Netherdeep to get more and more of this material. And they also have like 5 leaders, and guess what? I'm not going to worry about most of their names. Knowing one is enough for right now. That will get you started, and you can always introduce more as your PCs go down this route. Next, we have the Library of the Cobalt Soul. This is the last faction that your players could join. They're a little bit more religious and less scholarly, but they are allied with the Allegiance of Allsight. But unlike the other 2 factions that just are really just gung-ho to harvest as much ruidium as they can and really explore all this stuff, the Library of the Cobalt Soul is a little bit more skeptical of it, and eventually, at the end of their quest line, they want you to close it down and to keep people out of there. Speaking of the faction quests, each faction has 6 quests. The quests kind of break down into a formula. The first 3 are a little bit more varied, although all of the factions have one quest that deals with a ruidium elephant. That's sort of a common factor that sort of introduces you to the power of this material. Now the 4th, 5th, and 6th quests are all pretty similar between them. It's getting into Kael Morro, finding the key to the Netherdeep, and then doing something in the Netherdeep. And those 3, no matter which faction you're with, are very similar and kind of close out our adventure here. There's also a couple of other factions operating within the city. There's the Hand of Ord. That's basically the police. And there's the Scar Bearers. They're sort of like a thuggish secret service. They get more high profile jobs, protecting the entrance to Kael Morro. If you want to simplify, you probably could get away with combining the Hand of Ord and the Scar Bearers. Then we have our criminal underbelly, that's the Veil. They might come in if you have other side quests or other things where you need another entity to sort of motivate something that happens, something that the players do, something to interfere with what they're doing. The last minor faction is the Sentinels of Memory. They're allied with the Consortium of the Vermilion Dream, and similarly they don't get along, or they're on the opposite side as the Allegiance of Allsight. The major difference here is they're not trying to harvest ruidium. They actually kind of want to protect and close things down. But they're not above using, shadier tactics like assassins to get their way. One more thing I would review before my players get here is the urban chase tactics in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There are multiple instances throughout this chapter where it came up that you might use this, and it actually is potentially the very first thing you might do here. So that's the overview of sort of the politics of this city. As far as like the physical descriptions and the locations, you start off with, no matter how you get here, there's a short box text that sort of explains things. Your PCs, depending on their background, may have never been to Marquette. They might not have a huge familiarity with where they are. I'm not going to like just dump the map on them right away. I'm gonna let them wander around and explore and find their own map, or wait until one of the NPCs gives it to them. I also don't want to dump tons of information about the city right up front either. I think sometimes when you describe too much all at once, it gets lost, and sometimes players just sort of zone out, or it gets a little boring if you do it all together in a big clump. So what I would do is, read that initial box text, and then each time players go to a new location, not only describe that location, but maybe try and reveal a little bit more, because each location might be in a different district, and the districts have sort of their own feel and vibe, and some of them have their own pictures as well. That will help slowly build up the picture of this city. There are other things that might be unique here that they haven't seen too, like the architecture, and also the fact that there are sky ships. Wildmount only has a skyport in Port Damali. They may not have encountered these in their lives, depending on their backgrounds. And I think this is a detail that just really will make this city seem a lot bigger than what they're used to. As far as moving the adventure along, hopefully we've planted enough seeds, or the conclusions of what happened in chapter 3 are enough to get us connected to a faction right away. But if something happens and your PCs get stalled, don't forget that any NPC from one of the factions that they've met that knows that they have a vestige of divergence or have had these visions might recruit them a little bit harder, knowing that they have some connection to what's going on beneath the city. Our overall goal here isn't to just memorize a bunch of stuff. You just can't cram that much into your brain usually. What we want to do is know enough to be ready to react and do things that will make sense with this world. That can be scarier than having a set path, but actually one thing that players do is they generally discuss their plans amongst themselves and, hey, what do you want to do next? Or what should we do? Or what do you think of what just happened? I'm still listening to them, but what I like to do is start skimming around and building what they'll do next based on what they're saying, and thinking through the possibilities in my head as they're going. The Gazetteer also does us a big favor. So underneath the location name, there's usually just a subhead that's just the nuts and bolts of what it is. A tavern, the hideout for this group, a university. When my players are talking about what they're gonna do next, I'm probably just gonna page through and skim those till I find a location that seems to fit with what I'm thinking they could do and encounter in this city that will help propel them forward. I probably won't remember the name of each district at first until we start playing through too. A big way that I'm just gonna remember them is, hey, there's a scholarly district with the university and the Allegiance and the library. Hey, there's a district where it's just residences. There's a district where all the like worship stuff happens. There's the palace. Remembering the big picture districts, not what they're called, but kind of what happens there and what these different pockets of the city are, is really what I'm going for, because when I need to improvise, I can look up the name in 2 seconds. That part isn't so hard. Once we've gotten to a point where the PCs seem to have settled with the faction and maybe done the first quest, that's where I'm gonna really hone in on the details of their entire quest line and start to read them carefully and think through and build out those encounters. Now, the possibility exists that your PCs, especially as they do this and learn more about the factions, may end up disagreeing with the faction or wanting to switch factions or something like that. I'm still gonna keep sort of the first quest or so in mind for the other factions, but I haven't planned those out deeply if it doesn't look like the players are gonna go in that direction. Another thing that I'll probably do is have the rivals lay low at first in this chapter until it seems like the PCs have settled with the faction. Now, they may seek them out and need to come up, but I'm still gonna have them sort of unaligned with the faction if I can. I want the PCs to sort of pick on their own, and then obviously the rivals will sort of go with the opposite faction. If the players do switch factions, I'm probably not gonna have them do another Ruidium Elephant quest. There's one quest that I really like, and that's the second quest with the Consortium of the Vermilion Dream. I call it the reverse heist. They're supposed to stop a heist from happening. This is just a really well-designed quest, and it's basically mercenary work. They go to a third party and they're just supposed to return money to the Consortium. So I think it's okay to sort of pair this with some other entity in the city. If they don't go with the Consortium and I want to use that quest, I might use it to tie in one of the PC's backstories. If they have people from their past or things that they believe in, maybe there's a way to work that in. I'm gonna try to fit it in, but obviously sometimes these things just don't work out and happen, and that's okay too. Speaking of quests, most of the quests for the factions say that oh, after 7 days this happens, after 7 days this happens. So there's these gaps of a whole week. You could, do a couple days and then fast forward some of it, but this is a good opportunity to, one, let the PCs sort of explore and do things they want to do in town and just be ready to improvise that, but also to maybe start as a DM designing just a little piece of your own homebrew, just maybe a little mini quest or a little thing for them to do in town. You know, you have the setting here, you have all this stuff ready for you to go. So this is a nice place to sort of stretch your wings and like exercise your ability to sort of create something that isn't the module. You know, you make it yourself, and really try that out here. When you do have to improvise stuff on the fly, or you are designing your own quest, a nice thing to use is a fantasy name generator. So I'll link one down below. It's helped me out a lot with coming up with NPC names or location names, and some of the stuff that it comes up with are kind of silly names or aren't the coolest, like most dramatic names, but honestly, some of the silly ones are some of my favorite memories of playing the game, so it works out. Okay, so that's the broad overview of Ank'Harel. I know being in a big urban metropolis like this can be a little daunting, and it means there might be a little bit more improvisation than you're used to as a newer DM, but I know you've got this. If you like this, please give a thumbs up, and there's more guides coming for Call of the Netherdeep, so subscribe if you want those. Until then, keep rolling and have fun.